What if I told you that the same church that preached chastity was secretly running Europe's largest sex empire? Sounds insane, right? That's because the real Middle Ages weren't holy, they were horrifying. Forget everything you learned in school. Because this isn't the history they put in textbooks. This is the forbidden history, the kind that was buried under centuries of silence, shame, and secrets. You probably think medieval people were all about purity prayer and sexual restraint. Rosaries, monasteries, and maybe a shy kiss after marriage, if that. But here's the truth. Medieval sexuality was so wild, so weird, and so deeply unhinged that it makes modern hookup culture look like a convent. And no, that's not hyperbole. That's historical fact, and it's about to destroy everything you thought you knew about the so-called Dark Ages. Because these weren't just strange bedroom customs. These were state-sanctioned rituals, church-blessed violations, and scientifically insane beliefs that governed when, how, and why people had sex. There were laws about which direction your bed should face, priests who blessed magical underwear, and doctors who believed sneezing could prevent pregnancy. I'm serious. This wasn't history. It was hysteria in a crown and robe. We're diving into the darkest, most disturbing corner of medieval culture, the sex lives of people who thought the earth was flat, but were somehow sure they could influence conception by tying off the left testicle. You'll meet virginity inspectors, court-ordered sex judges, and entire towns that hosted public honeymoon ceremonies where your in-laws would literally watch you consummate the marriage. This isn't fiction, it's fact. Just the kind that was too embarrassing to survive the printing press. So, if you've ever wondered what people were really doing behind castle walls or why the same institutions that preached virtue were buying brothel property by the acre stick around, because the rabbit hole we're about to enter, it's deep dark and decorated with medieval lingerie blessed by monks. And it all starts with one of the most awkward dating customs in human history, a tradition so twisted it involved sacks, planks of wood, and zero privacy. Welcome to the world of bundling. And trust me, this is where the nightmare begins. Imagine this. You're a teenager in a small medieval village. You've never gone on a date. You've never touched someone outside your own family. You've barely seen someone your age naked unless they were dying of plague. And one day your parents tell you it's time to meet your potential spouse. Sounds wholesome, right? Now here's the catch. They tie you inside a sack, shove a wooden board between you and the stranger, and tuck you into the same bed for the entire night. Congratulations, you've just been bundled. And yes, that was a real thing. Bundling, or as I like to call it, the world's least romantic sleepover, was a common courtship tradition in rural Europe and colonial America. Instead of dinner and a movie, bundling involved two unmarried people literally wrapped together in a shared bed, usually with a bundling board between them to prevent physical contact. But if that sounds awkward, trust me, it gets worse. This wasn't done in secret. It was encouraged by parents, endorsed by communities, and treated as a practical step toward marriage. Families believed bundling gave young couples a chance to get to know each other in complete darkness in the same bed, fully clothed, and often supervised by people in the next room. Because nothing says romantic connection like sweating beside a stranger while trying not to make physical contact or noise. What makes bundling truly unsettling isn't just the bizarre logistics, it's the moral dissonance it reveals. These were the same societies that burned people for adultery, banned dancing on Sundays, and obsessed over virginity. Yet they thought it was totally reasonable to toss two hormonal teenagers into a bed and expect them to simply talk about marriage prospects until sunrise. It's like telling a kid not to eat the cookies, then locking them in the pantry overnight. And guess what? It backfired. Hard. Historical records show that pregnancy rates among bundled couples were significantly higher than among those who courted the traditional way. Turns out that wrapping two curious young people in burlap and prayer doesn't exactly cancel biology. It just makes it more creative. But here's where the cracks in our modern assumptions really begin to show. We like to imagine the past as a place of moral clarity, strict rules, clear boundaries, black and white values. But bundling proves otherwise. These communities weren't guided by logic or purity. They were guided by fear, fantasy, and contradiction. And in trying to control human behavior, They ended up inventing systems that invited exactly what they feared most. The bundling industry became so normalized that special bedding gear was manufactured just for this purpose. Custom bags, boards, even rope systems to hold people in place. Whole side economies existed just to facilitate this premarital awkwardness. Imagine walking into a medieval market and hearing one bundling board and a chastity sack, please. And of course, the church hated it. Religious leaders called it sinful, dangerous, and morally corrupt. But they couldn't stop it. Bundling was too deeply woven into the fabric of rural life, too tolerated to be banned, too shameful to be discussed openly. It existed in that gray zone of medieval morality, not holy, not hellish, just uncomfortably human. And honestly, that might be the most revealing part. Because bundling isn't just a weird historical fact. It's a window into how people dealt with desire they weren't allowed to name, impulses they couldn't control, and systems that punished them for being human. It shows us that behind the lace and incense of medieval virtue was a society desperately trying to manage sexuality with ropes, rituals, and planks of wood. And here's the part that hits a little too close to home: bundling isn't gone. It just looks different now. We still create elaborate systems to manage intimacy. We still use fear, shame, and moral superiority to disguise the fact that we're afraid of our own desires. We build digital bundling boards, apps, filters, policies that try to control how we connect. But deep down, we're still two strangers in a sack pretending the board will save us. So the next time you hear someone romanticize old-fashioned values, just remember those values once included wrapping kids like sausages, putting a plank between their bodies, and hoping for the best. That wasn't discipline. That was denial, dressed up as virtue. And it was just the beginning of how medieval people tried and failed to control the uncontrollable. Because from here on out, things don't get better. They get hornier, holier, and horrifyingly more elaborate. And you're about to see just how far they went to turn dinner into foreplay, marriage into performance, and virginity into a courtroom exhibit. If bundling was the warm-up act, then the next chapter of medieval sexuality was the full-blown performance, one drenched in desperation, delusion, and boiled animal testicles. Welcome to the aphrodisiac feasts. Because in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just nourishment. It was a weapon, a spell, a last-ditch effort to control nature by shoving it down your throat. We're not talking about oysters and strawberries here. We're talking about bull testicles boiled in wine sparrow brains, smashed into honey, and love cakes baked with ingredients that would make a modern FDA agent pass out. This was cuisine as seduction magic, and it wasn't optional. If you were wealthy, you were expected to serve these dishes at your wedding, your engagement, even your church-blessed first night. Sex wasn't just physical, it was ceremonial. And the table was the altar. The logic was disturbing but consistent. If you eat fertility, you'll become fertile. If you consume lust, you'll become lustful. So medieval cooks became alchemists of desire, churning out dishes designed to manipulate the body and dominate the soul. Recipes included the genitals of young animals, bulls, rams, boars, carefully prepared to preserve their energetic essence. These weren't delicacies. They were edible superstitions. And yet people ate them, not because they wanted to, but because they were told to. Because entire social expectations, family honor, and reproductive pressure hinged on their ability to perform. Imagine sitting at your own wedding, staring at a plate of fried testicles, knowing that everyone in the room is waiting to see if they worked. That's not dinner. That's psychological warfare. Even worse, the women rarely had a say. Brides were expected to eat these dishes as part of preparation, while grooms were often surrounded by men joking, pressuring, and demanding confidence. It was ritualized performance anxiety, served with saffron and forced smiles. And if you think this sounds invasive, remember in the next room, the bed was being made for the main event. Yes, that event. These aphrodisiac feasts weren't some fringe custom. They were mainstream, documented, and medically sanctioned. Medieval physicians wrote entire treatises on which foods increased lust, including cumin, mustard, pepper, pine nuts, and even mint. These texts weren't sold in back alleys. They were studied by scholars, prescribed by doctors, and sometimes even funded by monasteries. The line between science and sorcery had collapsed, and people clung to these recipes the way modern couples cling to fertility apps. Not because they worked, but because doing nothing felt worse. Because to be unable to perform, to fail in your duty, was not just embarrassing, it was dangerous. In a world where producing an heir meant everything, where a woman's worth was often measured in wombs, where a man's failure in the bedroom could unravel entire land deals, food became the front line of survival. And when it didn't work, when the bride bled too much or not at all, when the groom drank the wine and still couldn't rise to the occasion, it wasn't the meal they blamed. It was the person. Now imagine the emotional weight of that. You're 16. You've never kissed anyone. You've barely had a real conversation with your spouse-to-be. And now in front of your entire village, you're being fed an animal's testicles while everyone prepares for your sexual debut. You're not in love. You're in ceremonial captivity. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't empowering. It was a prison wrapped in herbs and honey. A moment where your body stopped being yours and became an offering to your family, your church, your country. And here's the viral truth. No one tells you this wasn't private. People watched, witnessed, judged. Every failure became gossip. Every rumor became reputation. A soft glance at dinner, a hiccup in the bedroom, a missing stain on a sheet, it could ruin you. Because in medieval society, sexual failure wasn't just personal. It was political. And when people started failing en masse, when aphrodisiac feasts didn't produce heirs, when blessed wine didn't bring arousal, that's when the blame shifted. Not to the rituals, not to the insane food, but to the women, to the weak, to the supposedly impure. Because patriarchy always finds a scapegoat when superstition fails. Let that sink in. These weren't accidents. These were systems. Elaborate mechanisms designed to transfer sexual responsibility onto the powerless while pretending it was divine tradition. You weren't allowed to say no. You weren't allowed to fail. You were barely allowed to think. All you could do was eat what they gave you, obey what they said, and pray your body didn't betray you. So, next time you hear someone joke about medieval cooking, remember for hundreds of thousands of people that food wasn't a choice. It was a curse with seasoning. And for many, it was the beginning of a nightmare that didn't end with dessert, but with public judgment, ruined reputations, or forced annulment. Because the feast wasn't about pleasure, it was about control. And what came after the meal, that was the real performance. The part where you were undressed in front of your own family. The part where you were expected to prove your worth not with words, but with your body. And that is where we're headed next. You've survived the bundling board. You've swallowed the aphrodisiac feast. But now comes the part that no modern mind is ever truly ready for, the moment when sex stopped being intimate and became public property. This is not metaphor. This is medieval law, and the most sacred part of marriage. It wasn't the vows. It was the part where everyone watched you prove them. In the Middle Ages, consummation wasn't private. It was legally required, socially witnessed, and sometimes physically supervised. Without consummation, a marriage didn't count. No land changed hands, no alliances were sealed, no heirs were expected. The bed wasn't just a bed, it was a courtroom. And the audience, your family, your priests, and half your political enemies. Let's be clear, this wasn't just for kings and queens. Any marriage involving property power or reputation could be subject to a witnessed bedding ceremony. If there was something at stake, there was someone watching. And the process, it was pure, ritualized humiliation. After the wedding, the bride and groom were led through the castle or village in a procession. Guests sang songs, rang bells, and threw flowers, not to celebrate love, but to mark the beginning of the performance. The couple was then escorted into a specially prepared chamber, but they weren't alone. Not yet. Relatives were present, mothers, fathers, clergy, nobles. The bride was undressed by her female family members, the groom by his male kin. Because gendered strip shows were apparently a sacred part of holy matrimony. Then they were put into bed, literally placed there, sometimes naked, sometimes in ceremonial undergarments. And then the guests stayed. Some watched from the edge of the room, Others gave instructions, commentary, even encouragement. There are records of noblemen clapping during penetration of priests praying aloud, during the act of entire entourages remaining in the room for the full duration. This wasn't romance. This was surveillance, disguised as tradition. And if you're wondering, yes, it got worse. In many cases, the bed sheets were examined after the act. Guests, often women of noble birth or religious status, would check for blood as evidence of virginity. No blood, no proof. No proof, no marriage. And if there were doubts, the couple might be required to repeat the act. With new witnesses, fresh linens, and a growing sense of psychological collapse. Because this wasn't about love. It wasn't even about sex. It was about legitimacy, about ownership, about control. The bride wasn't just expected to give her body. She was expected to surrender it under scrutiny. The groom wasn't just supposed to perform. He had to succeed under pressure with his family's future and fortune dangling on the edge of his anatomy. This wasn't intimacy. It was a test, a trial, a spectacle, and the consequences of failure were real. There are historical cases of annulled marriages because the consummation wasn't properly witnessed, because someone peeked through the wrong door or the wrong person was in the room. In one instance, the couple had to reconsummate the marriage with additional witnesses and written verifications signed by noblemen and clergy. That's not love. That's legalized voyeurism backed by bureaucracy. Think about what that does to a person. To know that your most private moment is not yours. That your worth, your reputation, your entire future depends on being watched, being judged, and being believed. That if your body doesn't perform the way they want it to, you are worthless, broken, replaceable. This is where the medieval marriage reveals its true face. It wasn't a bond of souls. It was a contract of flesh, a transaction of blood, sweat, and silence. And if you think this was rare, think again. There were even etiquette manuals describing how witnesses should behave, where to stand, what to say, how long to remain in the room. Some even instructed them to hum softly to make the couple more comfortable, as if musical accompaniment could soften the horror. And remember, failure didn't just affect you. It affected your entire family, your lineage, your village's alliances, your dowry, your legal status, your very identity as husband or wife. So when people say things like, "We need to return to traditional values," ask them, which part exactly? The testicles at dinner? Or the part where your uncle stands in the corner while you lose your virginity? Because this was the high point of medieval morality. A moment where religion, law, sex, and shame collided in the same room and nobody saw anything wrong with it. You weren't just married. You were monitored. Your body was no longer your own. It belonged to the system, to the family, to the witnesses. And if you couldn't prove your virginity or your performance, you weren't a newlywed. You were a liability. This was the ritual. This was the rule. This was the reality. And it only gets darker from here, because if you think having sex in front of an audience was the worst it could get, wait until the state starts assigning astrologers to schedule your conception window, measuring your lustful energies by the moon cycle, and prescribing intercourse with one testicle tied off. Yes, that actually happened. And it's coming next. If public sex ceremonies were the spectacle, then what came after was the fallout, the part where the system tried to own your body permanently. Because in the Middle Ages, sex wasn't just monitored. It was scheduled, blessed, predicted, and when needed, blamed. Welcome to the final chapter of medieval sexuality, where your fertility became a state-controlled experiment and your bedroom turned into a celestial crime scene. Let's start with the stars. Medieval people believed conception was a sacred math problem, one that required perfect planetary alignment, ideal moon phases, and the right direction of the bed, usually east, to honor the rising sun. You didn't just try for a baby. You consulted astrologers, priests, and physicians, all of whom told you exactly when to do it, how to lie, where to look, and which organs to bless. Because apparently Mars decided if your kid would be brave, and Jupiter would determine if they'd have a penis. Some couples were told to have sex only on Tuesdays during a waxing moon after a prayer to St. Agatha, but not during Lent, not on feast days, not during menstruation, and definitely not on a Wednesday if Mercury was in retrograde. This wasn't love. This was astronomical anxiety. And if you couldn't conceive, the shame didn't just haunt you, it branded you. You were a failure, a spiritual defect, an empty vessel. Desperate to fix this medieval society, built an arsenal of solutions, each more absurd, invasive, and psychologically violating than the last. They wore blessed fertility belts made of silk linen or leather inscribed with biblical verses and astrological symbols. Not for style, for function. The belts were believed to channel divine energy directly to the uterus, as if God was waiting for a dress code to approve conception. Women carried amulets filled with unicorn horn powder, which was actually narwhal tusk bits of parchment with Latin incantations, even ground gemstones sewn into their undergarments. Some would place conception stones near or inside themselves during sex, sapphires for girls, emeralds for boys, diamonds for twins. That wasn't jewelry. That was medieval gender selection technology. And let's not forget the men. They were told to tie off their left testicle if they wanted a son because the right one contained the male seed. There were manuals explaining which ring to wear, which hand to stroke your beard with, and how many Hail Marys to whisper while thrusting. It was medieval sex as choreography judged by God, timed by Saturn, and scored by the Virgin Mary. But when all that failed, and it often did, the panic reached its peak. That's when the solutions became deadly. Medieval birth control was a nightmarish catalog of medical misinformation and magical delusion. Women drank mercury iron shavings, crushed beaver testicles, or potions made from rue pennyroyal and even powdered bones. Some methods induced violent sneezing right after sex. Yes, they thought sneezing would eject sperm, while others shoved honey-soaked wool crocodile dung or vinegar-soaked sponges into their bodies to kill seed. Not only were these methods ineffective, they were fatal. Some women died trying not to get pregnant. And in many cases, that was quietly accepted. Because a dead woman couldn't embarrass the system. A dead woman couldn't ask questions. A dead woman simply disappeared, another statistic in a holy war against natural biology. Let that sink in. They told you when to conceive. They told you how. They told you what to wear, what to eat, how to breathe, where to point your bed. They blessed your sheets, cursed your fluids, and demanded proof of performance. And when none of it worked, they blamed you. This wasn't medicine. This was ritualized gaslighting centuries before the term existed. You weren't allowed to fail. You weren't allowed to rest. You weren't even allowed to be uncertain. If your womb didn't produce, it wasn't bad luck, it was divine punishment. Your value wasn't measured by love, loyalty, or intelligence. It was measured by the presence or absence of a crying infant. And that pressure, that inescapable terror of being biologically condemned, it didn't vanish after marriage. It followed people to their deaths. There are records of women buried with their fertility belts, of men castrated and branded for failing to produce heirs, of children given names based on the moon cycle they were conceived under because even your identity belonged to the stars. This is where the story of medieval sexuality truly breaks the spine of modern logic. Because beneath all the absurdity, behind the superstition, underneath the lace and velvet and incense, was a system built to erase choice, to punish nature, and to glorify obedience. There was no safe path, no soft landing, no normal couple. Everyone was trapped. Trapped in rituals and fear and impossible expectations. You couldn't just love someone. You had to time your desire to match the church's calendar and the sky's permission. And what does that leave behind? A legacy of trauma so deep it echoes in the silence of unmarked graves, in the worn bindings of forgotten medical texts, in the tight smiles of ancestors who never had a say. They didn't die for love. They were buried under systems that called themselves sacred but were never humane. And if you think this story ends here, you haven't heard what the church was doing with brothels. Because next religion gets into the sex trade. Literally. And it's not what you think. So here we are. At the end of a journey through chambers no one wanted to remember and rituals no one dared to question. We've seen sex turned into ceremony, meals turned into manipulation, and bodies, especially female ones, turned into bargaining chips in games they never agreed to play. And now you know. This wasn't about romance. It was about control disguised as culture, obedience dressed up as holiness. If you're feeling shocked, disturbed, or even a little betrayed by the past, good. That means your instincts are still intact. That means some part of you knows this wasn't just history. This was horror with a halo. And the scariest part? It was all considered normal. Because that's how systems of control survive. They don't need chains. They just need tradition, silence, a sense of duty, a plank of wood between you and your freedom. And now that you've seen behind the curtain, you can't unsee it. So here's what you can do next. Drop a comment below. Which part shattered your view of the Middle Ages the most? The forced sex rituals, the magical underwear, the church-run brothels. Save this video because trust me, you'll want to revisit what your history teacher never mentioned. And if you're still with me right now, you're one of the rare ones. The curious, the brave, the ones who don't look away. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button and join us as we keep peeling back the layers of what history tried to hide. Because truth isn't always clean, but it's always necessary.